various websites all over the internet are selling products known as SARMs. That's SARMS. What are SARMs? Okay, it's an acronym standing for Selective Androgen Receptor Modulators. And what they are they're kind of new drugs. They were developed in the late 90s, 1998 to be specific was the first one. And they basically are meant to possibly displace testosterone in the treatment of low testosterone syndromes or men with hypogonadism, low testosterone. To understand how they work, you have to understand that they interact with, obviously, they're called androgen receptor modulators, which would indicate that they interact with the androgen receptor. The androgen receptor is the receptor on cells that interacts with testosterone and other androgens, such as dihydrotestosterone, which is a byproduct of testosterone and actually has a much tighter affinity to androgen receptors than testosterone itself. Now, the thing is, unless testosterone or testosterone-like analogs such as anabolic steroids, unless they can interact with the androgen receptor, they don't do anything. In other words, they become active in the cell by interacting with the androgen receptor. Now, testosterone itself was isolated by a group of scientists in 1935, and the first anabolic steroid, strangely enough, was actually synthesized even before testosterone was first isolated, and that was methyl testosterone. That was the first anabolic steroid. That was in 1934. The problem with both testosterone and anabolic steroids, by the way, just so you know, are basically modified forms of testosterone. Most of the oral steroids, they have been structurally modified to prevent premature breakdown in the liver, because when you take testosterone orally, liver enzymes break it down and they convert it into water-soluble substances, and they're excreted out of the kidneys. So what scientists did in the early 50s was modify the structure of testosterone to prevent the premature breakdown of testosterone in the liver. And this is what became anabolic steroids. That feature of anabolic steroids, however, the fact that it's resistant to breakdown in the liver, is its biggest drawback, because oral steroids tend to accumulate in the liver. In other words, the liver doesn't break them down fast enough, and as such, they kind of bring on a fairly rapid localized inflammation of the liver, which is basically medically known as a hepatitis. Hepatitis simply is a general term meaning inflammation of the liver. Now, when the liver gets inflamed from anabolic steroids, the circulation of bile, which is produced in the liver and stored in the gallbladder, the circulation of bile is inhibited by the localized inflammation in the liver, which leads to a condition called cholestasis, which basically eventually can cause destruction of the liver cells. And this is why anabolic steroids are kind of dangerous for the liver, especially if they're used in large quantities. The good news is that the liver has a tremendous regenerative capacity. You could remove 2/3 of the liver and still survive. You can't say that with many other organs. Anyway, let's get back to SARMs. I got a little bit off track here, but I wanted to explain. The problem with testosterone anabolic steroids is that they work through what they call androgenic and anabolic effects. The anabolic effects are considered the desirable effects. It includes increase in lean body mass, such as muscle, and an increase in bone mass. The androgenic effects are, I guess you could say, they're good and bad. I mean, without androgenic effects, you wouldn't have the development of male sex organs, which is actually promoted by dihydrotestosterone. But a lot of the negative, let's say negative side effects of anabolic steroids and testosterone are more related to the androgenic effects. And some of these side effects include male pattern baldness, possible acne, and possible adverse effects on the prostate in the sense of prostate enlargement, although not prostate cancer. So the thing is, the goal of the pharmacologists or the steroid chemists who work with this testosterone anabolic steroids has always been to develop a drug that is as anabolic as possible and has the least amount of androgenic effects. the holy grail of that particular branch of pharmacology would be nearly a 100% anabolic drug, and that has never, ever happened. There's no such thing as a 100% anabolic drug. However, in the development of steroids, starting in the 50s, there was thousands of them developed. A lot of them made it to market, others didn't. Others were later sold as pro-hormones, over-the-counter pro-hormones. I'm talking about these early steroids. However, some of them were developed, and their let's say their basic structure. By the way, the basic steroid structure is derived from cholesterol. That's the raw material for all steroids. In any case, as anabolic steroids were developed, scientists were able to produce steroids that are much more anabolic than testosterone. You know, bodybuilders, athletes are familiar with some of these steroids. For example, Anavar, Anadrol 50, all these things, they're much more anabolic than actual testosterone. But the point here is that they are not they're not androgenic free. Even the so-called more anabolic of the anabolic steroids, such as Anavar, which is considered to have low androgenic effects, still provides androgenic effects. So, you know, the goal then was to, well, this is problematic for somebody who has, let's say, low testosterone, because you have to understand, both testosterone and anabolic steroid, they were never really developed for athletic use or for the building muscle. They do aid in that, let's say, goal, but that's not their primary purpose. The primary purpose of testosterone and anabolic steroids is to treat medical diseases such as sarcopenia, which is a loss of muscle with age, bone mass loss, and also what they call cachexia, a loss of lean mass associated with wasting diseases such as certain forms of cancer and AIDS. That's the actual, and also the early use, I should say, was to treat certain forms of anemia, but that's been superseded by drugs such as EPO and EPO analogs. EPO stands for erythropoietin. That's a whole different subject. I'm not going to talk about that. Anyway, the point is, let's get back to SARMs. So anyway, with all these problems associated with testosterone, the possible side effects, and of course anabolic steroids, they being really kind of hard on the liver, especially if used in larger quantities, scientists are been trying to figure out a way to, again, produce substances that will emphasize the anabolic effect and be actually more selective. In other words, they wanted a drug that would work on the androgen receptor, which turns on these anabolic effects, but without having some overlapping effect, producing those other side effects that I mentioned earlier. Now, you should know that a lot of the side effects related to the androgenic effects of anabolic steroids and testosterone are due to the conversion of testosterone and steroids into other substances. For example, testosterone can be converted by the 5-alpha reductase enzymes into dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. DHT is thought to be responsible for male pattern baldness, acne, and possibly, although it's still become questionable, prostate enlargement. Now, the other possibility is that testosterone and steroids can be converted into estrogen through the actions of the aromatase hormone, and estrogen produces its own set of side effects, including in large amounts cardiovascular side effects. So anyway, the scientists went back to the drawing board in the late 90s, and they developed these drugs which they called SARMs. And here's where they got the idea for SARMs. There was already an existing, let's say, group of drugs called SARMs. What does SARMs stand for? SARMs stands for Selective Estrogen Receptor Modulators. Obviously, these drugs work on the estrogen receptor. Now, while there is only one androgen receptor, there's two kinds of estrogen receptors labeled estrogen receptor A and estrogen receptor B. The SARM drugs have one medical use, basically, and that's to treat estrogen-sensitive cancers in women, particularly postmenopausal or breast cancer that occurs in older women. One of the more familiar SARMs that especially to bodybuilders and athletes, is a drug called tamoxifen citrate under the trade name Nolvadex. Nolvadex has been used for many years, since I believe around the early 80s. It's been used by bodybuilders and athletes to control the estrogen that might be produced when using anabolic steroids that can convert into estrogen or testosterone. Now, what tamoxifen or Nolvadex does is it basically blocks the estrogen receptor. And as I said earlier, if a steroid hormone such as testosterone or estrogen cannot interact with the receptor, they don't do anything. They're inert. They have to interact with the receptor. So scientists looked at this action of, let's say, Nolvadex or other SARMs drugs, and they said, wait a minute, why don't we develop a drug that works on the androgen receptor? And actually, it's a little easier to do that because there's only one androgen receptor, and there's two estrogen receptors, but there's one androgen receptor. So anyway, these scientists developed these drugs called SARMs, and what they did is basically the big feature of SARMs is that they do not. Well, there's a couple of features. One is that they're mostly oral drugs. That's one. The second thing is most of them are non-steroidal. They're not steroids. They are not steroids. They are not peptides. That's another feature. Perhaps the biggest feature of them, though, and this is the thing that's attractive to medical doctors who want to treat men with low testosterone, is that SARMs do not convert into either estrogen or DHT. As a consequence, theoretically, most of the side effects associated with testosterone and anabolic steroids should not exist with SARMs. It's the closest to an pure anabolic drug that they've been able to come up with. But here's a very key point that's important to know. SARMs are not 100% anabolic. They still provide androgenic effects. Why am I emphasizing this? Because all these sites on the internet that are selling these SARM drugs, and I'll get to that in a minute, they're advertising that they're side effect free, and they don't cause any of the androgenic effects associated with testosterone and anabolic steroids, which is completely false. It's a lie. Another thing I want to let you guys know, or anyone watching this, all three of you, but anyway, anyone watching this, the drugs that are being sold, this is another important point. The SARMs that are being sold online on these various websites are what they call first generation SARMs. You have to understand, SARMs have been in continual synthesis and production, just like steroids were. Thousands of steroids were developed from the 50s on, all in an effort to try and improve, let's say, the benefit side effect profile of the steroids. Well, the same holds true for SARMs. The early ones, they've been superseded by a lot of newer ones that are actually much more potent from an anabolic sense, and also probably have less side effects than the original. But the ones that are sold online are the first generation SARMs, the older ones, right? Okay, now let's see what I wanted to tell you about this. Let me see here. Okay. Here's a couple of things that you have to know if you're considering purchasing some of these SARMs online. First of all, don't buy into the hype that's being written on these sites that sell SARMs. Don't believe that they don't have side effects. In all the studies that have been published so far related to SARMs, they have involved in vitro or isolated cell studies or studies with frail older people. There are absolutely no studies existing in the medical literature that have examined the effect of SARMs on a young, healthy, active, exercising population. There's no evidence at all. But now this raises the question. You're probably thinking, does that mean they don't work? No, they do work. But here's an important point. Just like in the steroids, let me backtrack. One of the main criticisms of the early steroid studies was that the dosages used in the studies were what were suggested to treat medical patients. They were very low dose studies, and athletes never use those suggested doses. They use 10, 15, 20, 30 times more. So this, of course, only the dose determines the poison. So the greater the dose you use of any drug, the greater the risk of side effects. And the same holds true for SARMs. Here's my point. The studies that looked at SARMs use the suggested dosages. And you want to put this in block letters, in bold print. even though suggested dosages produce side effects. And these were low dosages. Bodybuilders or athletes who purchase this stuff online, assuming that it actually is SARMs, are not going to use the suggested dosages. They're going to feel, if one tablet works good, I'm going to take 5 and get even bigger and stronger. But remember, even one tablet in the studies thus far published showed side effects. No one knows what's going to happen if you take large amounts. Now, again, that's an assumption that the SARMs being sold online are the genuine article, but we have no proof of this. And here, I want you folks to consider a couple of things. First of all, most of these SARMs, not most, all of them are experimental drugs. Experimental drugs. They have never been approved for human use. They are still, every single SARM that's in development or has ever been developed is an experimental drug. They've never been approved by the FDA or any drug licensing agency. Second is the fact that most of these drugs have patents. So the outfits that are selling this online already are breaking the law in several areas. They're selling unapproved drugs that have never been approved for human consumption. B, they're violating patents that are owned by the drug companies that are spending millions to develop these drugs. So by very virtue of those two facts, you know right off the bat you're dealing with, I'm going to use it, the word scumbags. The people selling these things online are scum. They're dishonest. They never reveal themselves. There's no street addresses. And furthermore, you have no idea that you're purchasing genuine SARMs when you buy from these online vendors. There was one study that purchased online SARMs. There was a study that involved scientists, I should say, that purchased SARMs from an online site, from several online sites. Now, the one that they purchased was one called S4, also called, it's called Androgenic is another name for it. And this happens to be one of the most popular of the current online SARMs. And when they did a drug analysis of this particular SARM, they found that it contained 15% impurities. In other words, the good news was that it actually did contain real S4. Most of these, I should tell you right off the bat, most of the SARMs, because they're experimental drugs, they have code names like S4 and S23 and GTX044, that kind of stuff, because they're not available. They're experimental drugs. But the thing is, you don't know. The thing is, the 15% impurities is an indication that they were made in some backdoor lab, because drug companies, you could say what you want about drug companies, whether you like them or you hate them, but the one thing that you have to say about them is that their drugs are pure. They don't allow impurities. You'll never find impurities in a drug produced by actual pharmaceutical companies for human use. Now, what do these impurities in SARMs do? Your guess is as good as mine. Nobody knows. I myself would not even consider using a drug that contains unknown impurities. You have no idea what they could be. They could be heavy metals, like for some of the black market steroids contain heavy metal toxic drugs and all that stuff. I mean, you don't know what you're dealing with. So that's one thing to consider. And also, if you do get ripped off, what are you going to do about it? There's no names, there's no addresses, there's no nothing. You have no recourse other than to just take it. There's nothing you can do. Okay. Now, another thing. Let's also just talk about some of the side effects that they have noticed in these studies using normal dosages of SARMs. They've discovered that some of them lower what they call HDL, high-density lipoprotein cholesterol. This is a protective form of cholesterol that actually protects against cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. Some of the SARMs also seem to boost liver enzymes. Some of the other SARMs, in fact, the newer versions of SARMs, the ones that are more potent from an anabolic sense, also actually do the same thing that steroids and testosterone do, which is activate the negative feedback loop to the pituitary gland, which in simple terms means it turns off your own testosterone. It turns off your own testosterone production. If these sound familiar, these are actually the same side effects that you get from using oral anabolic steroids and injectable steroids. So, in other words, the newer SARMs, that's probably why they're not on the market, because for all the work the scientists have done in developing them, there's really no great difference between them and anabolic steroids, except for one thing. Now, this is the big shocker of all. This is the big shocker of all. Guess what? These sites which claim that these SARMs are more potent than anabolic steroids, it's complete and utter nonsense. It's not true. Let me read this. This is directly from a study. Let me turn on this light here. This is directly from a study that was done on SARMs. I'm going to read it to you. At the doses that have been tested, the first generation SARMs, now the first generation SARMs are the ones being sold online. The first generation SARMs induce modest gains in lean body mass in healthy volunteers, which are nowhere near the much greater gains in skeletal muscle mass reported with supraphysiological doses of testosterone. The modest gains of 1.0 to 1.5 kilograms in fat-free mass with first-generation SARMs over 4 to 6 weeks should be contrasted with the 5 to 7 kilogram gains in fat-free mass with 300 and 600 milligram doses of testosterone and anthane. However, it is possible that the next generation of SARM molecules will have greater potency and selectivity than the first generation SARMs. So there you go. In other words, the SARMs that are being sold online, the so-called first generation SARMs, are not more potent than anabolic steroids. It's just another lie. So basically, another thing I wanted to tell you. Let me turn on this light. It's getting a little dark in here. Another thing I wanted to tell you is that beware of fake SARMs. I mean, we don't even know if the SARMs that are labeled SARMs online are real. But there's actually companies, unscrupulous companies, that are selling supplements that they're cashing in on the popularity of SARMs by calling themselves SARMs, and they're not SARMs at all. For example, there's a supplement called SARM-X. SARM-X. What is SARM-X? SARM-X contains no SARMs at all. What it actually contains is a substance called ferulic acid. Ferulic acid is commonly found in certain foods, such as oats and that type of stuff. The active ingredient in ferulic acid is what they call gamma-oryzanol. Gamma-oryzanol was touted as a popular testosterone booster in the late 80s until studies showed that it not only doesn't boost testosterone, but it inhibits testosterone. It blocks the release of luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland, which controls testosterone production. So this supplement called SARM-X, which is supposed to act like SARMs, works in reverse and lowers your testosterone. So beware of unscrupulous companies selling supplements that are reputed to be working like SARMs. It's nonsense. Don't waste your money. These are crooks and scumbags. Don't buy anything from them. Now, the question is, again, the bottom line, I'm not going to really go into detail about all the various SARMs other than to say that they started being produced in the late 90s. The early ones are, not that great. I mean, the feedback, even though those that did purchase online, the majority of those who used it actually said that they didn't get much out of it, which is understandable. If you follow if you actually do use the suggested dosage, they're not going to do much at all as far as building muscle. And that's assuming, again, that you're getting the real stuff. Now, as far as do they really work? Yes, they really work. The newer ones, the ones that are not online, are much more potent than the first generation. Unfortunately, along with the increased potency, you have increased side effects. Like I said, the inflammation of the liver, the lowering of the HDL, and the turning off of your own testosterone production. This probably all of this explains why SARMs are not on the market. I mean, you believe me, drug companies are about as greedy as you can get. And if they knew that they could make money off the SARMs, they would have found a way to get this stuff released. And the fact that they're still in an experimental stage speaks volumes about their actual efficacy. Again, though, I'm going to, for purposes of full disclosure, I'm not going to lie to you. The studies that did test SARMs on older people, in isolated cell studies, and in animals, did show definite anabolic effects. Yes, they do work. But again, they were very mild, the anabolic effects, and the dosages provided were what the suggested dosage would be low, and they did not involve higher dosages. Higher dosages, again, would most likely produce greater range of side effects. So the thing is, the bottom line, I'm going to a flat statement. I do not recommend anyone purchasing SARMs online. You don't know what you're getting, and the ones that are being sold online are first generation. They don't work that good. And don't waste your money. And I know that people will probably read on some of these forums and these groups. There'll be people raving about how great these SARMs are. Keep in mind that a lot of these people are shills that are associated with the company that sells SARMs, or companies that sell SARMs, or they could be the people themselves that sell SARMs, or the most likely way to explain these great endorsements is that it's a placebo effect. Never discount the placebo effect. I had a huge article about how the placebo effect affects exercise, nutrition, supplements in my Applied Metabolics newsletter. I explained just how potent they are. I mean, just how potent the placebo effect is. I mean, you can't discount them. If you believe something will work, it will work. It will work. In other words, if you really strongly, but it's not the stuff that's doing it. It's your belief that's producing the results. It's not the drug. So I have no doubt that some of these guys that are saying they're making a lot of gains from using these online SARMs are basically examples of the placebo effect. And by the way, if any of you are interested in learning about exercise science, nutrition, anti-aging, supplements, fat loss techniques, hormonal therapy, or ergogenic aids, I strongly suggest that you subscribe to my Applied Metabolics newsletter. I'm talking about stuff that you won't find anywhere. It's all evidence-based, and I'm not just giving you the results of various studies. I'm writing it in plain English. And the biggest feature of all is I'm also adding the 54 years of constant study and learning I've done related to these subjects, which is unavailable anywhere and which cannot be matched anywhere. So please consider subscribing to my Applied Metabolics newsletter. It's for 33 cents a day. You will be way ahead of the pack. You will know much more than just about anybody around you about these subjects, and you will not find this information anywhere online or in the magazines. Okay, so anyway, with that being said, by the way, this explains, you can see now why I didn't write about SARMs from my Applied Metabolics newsletter. I actually did the research for it, but I opted not to write it because I felt there was not really much to write about. I mean, I wasn't impressed by them, and there was no studies at all related to young, healthy population or people working out. And they're experimental drugs. I mean, they're not even available. I mean, I'm not going to write positive things about these things to enrich the bank accounts of these crooks and these scumbags that are selling them online. I'm not going to do that. So because people wanted some information, I did this video. With that being said, I don't want to leave on a negative note here. So I want to wish all of you a happy holiday. I'm making this video. It's like a day or two before Christmas. I hope you have a wonderful new year, and a new year in which all your dreams and aspirations come true. I mean that from my heart. Take care, and thank you for listening.